here's with today's Tuesday teaching tip. Today's tip is part 2 in a series of Introduction to Writer's Workshop lessons that I'll be sharing with you over the next several weeks. Alright, with that said, these introduction lessons, last week was lesson number 1, where we learned to set up our notebook and our table of contents, how to organize it, and our gathering ideas to write about. These first lessons I call the front-loading lessons. And the front-loading lessons are designed to set your reluctant or your emergent writer up for success. When we gather tons of ideas to write about, it helps them when they come to that blank piece of paper and you ask them to write. Well, they've got all of these ideas to gather from, all these ideas to write about, and they just have to choose one and start there. Another part of front-loading is reading lots of books in the particular genre that you're going to be writing about. We're going to start with personal narratives. The reason I start with personal narratives is because, like I said before, those are those stories that are personal to you. Those are the ones that have happened to you, and so those are easier for these reluctant and emergent writers to write. It might not be their favorite genre to read about, but it is a lot easier to write about what you know than it is to come up with these fanciful ideas or these nonfiction little stories to write about. And so we start with personal narratives. Part of the front loading with that is to introduce them to great examples of personal narrative. And so you might have some of these books on your shelves. You might have to go to used bookstores, online stores, and find some. And I've had some success both online and at used bookstores of finding some pretty inexpensive books. So I'm going to give you some examples of personal narratives that I've found, or stories that sound like personal narratives, and then you can start gathering some too. And what I do is I read these. We read several examples, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we continue to gather ideas to write about as I'm doing this. And if your writer is ready to start writing, if your student's ready to start writing, by all means let them start writing. So what you can do is find a halfway point in your journal, in their journal, fold one of the pages down like we did before, and let them start writing. If they're not ready to write yet, that's okay. In the next several lessons that we do, these are other front-loading lessons, introduction lessons that we're doing to scaffold their learning so that when they are ready to write, they have a lot of lessons from which to draw. All right. So what I did is I read The Raft, Something Beautiful, and My Rotten Red-Headed Older Brother as great examples of personal narratives. Now, these are interesting because the authors give you a little bit of insight as to how they gathered ideas to write about. So Patricia Polacco has some pictures that are near and dear to her heart. These pictures in particular of her and her brother, Richie, spurred on this idea for her to write about her brother, My Rotten Red-Headed Older Brother. And in this story, she and Richie had a rhubarb eating contest. And you find out a little something about Richie in the end. It's kind of surprise ending. And so this was a story that was near and dear to her heart. We talked about this book last time, Something Beautiful. What I didn't share with you is at the very end, the author's note, this story, Something Beautiful, was actually something that was near and dear to this author's heart, because she did live in a tough neighborhood. She did live in a neighborhood that she deemed wasn't so beautiful. And so her mother had given her one of her own wedding gifts to put into the windowsill so that her daughter had something beautiful to look at every day. And so that Something Beautiful inspired her to write this book. And finally, The Raft. The author of this story talks about summers spent with his grandparents and some of the adventures that he went on. And he said that some of these stories are like the bits and pieces of his boyhood summer that he kept in a cigar box. So he had kind of like we have our junk drawer, he had a cigar box where he kept little bits and pieces of his summers. And those bits and pieces inspired him to write The Raft, stories that are similar to things that happened to him when he was growing up. And so that's what we do to front load. We gather ideas to write about, and then we immerse our writers with great examples of personal narratives. So if they're given example after example of what a great personal narrative is, then they know what to draw from. I say that that's starting with the end in mind. This is a great example of a personal narrative. Now you know a little bit more about it. If you're ready to write, go ahead and write your story. If they're not ready to write yet, that's okay, because we have some more Introduction to Writers Workshop lessons to go, and hopefully in the next couple of lessons they'll be ready to write. And until then, see you next week.